Well, I think one wants to know what they're focused on, given that this is a call for action for a huge group of different players across society. But we are going to, the challenge is trying to boil the ocean, because there are so many things that affect healthy aging that one will have to choose. So, if you start talking about population health, that's on its own fairly all-encompassing. You then get into things like housing, again, hugely important. So I think that, the key things are, building this conversation around a few things that policymakers can really relate to and understand, because if we have everything, it becomes almost just too many.
It's a huge mandate that you've given yourselves at the moment.
Yeah.
What do you see as the biggest challenge? Is it drilling down into the themes and in a more granular way?
We've identified some key things here. So the social determinants of health. And I mean, why is it that people in some places live 20 years less than people in other places? Well, there's all sorts of reasons for that, of course. But understanding some of that is important, and trying to be clear about what are the quick wins. You could argue that 5 years in parts of Glasgow, where life expectancy is. There are some of those communities that have the lowest life expectancy in Britain, for example. Those might not be such hard wins in a sense, because there's such a people are dying at 60 or 65 when everybody else is dying at 80 or well over 80. Then in theory there are some simple steps that people could take that would make the difference. The challenge is, of course, there are lots of very good reasons why people don't do rational things.
Well, do you find with the massive chasm along the socioeconomic divide,
Sure.
It just becomes increasingly difficult to drive home the bigger message that you have agency over your own health? If you're counting pennies behind the sofa, I mean, what are your options?
Yeah, well, no, sure. Well, there are still interesting questions. Like, if I was suddenly on the dole, would I start smoking, drinking, and eating pies all the time, or would I, make risotto and eat vegetables? I'm being facetious, but there are things that we can do, and there are differences. Now, there are lots, we get into some difficult areas, but I think ultimately, it is about understanding the interventions that work, the understanding the early wins. There's all these interesting choices about, do you decide to focus on the localities and communities that have the lowest life expectancy, which is one option, or do you seek to have a rising tide which lifts all ships? Because there's both of them, and you might want to do both, and in fact I suspect we will. So we need everybody to understand that they're going to probably live longer than they've expected, and that there are things that they can do to have a healthy old age, which start long before. And that's one of the things at the Centre for Aging Better that I'm part of, where I'm a trustee, that we made the deliberate decision not to focus on, people who are already old, but to focus on people approaching old age, because what we need to do is get people in Britain to change their behaviour. And the changes in behaviour are as big as some of the ones that we've seen around things like changes in attitudes to homosexuality. When I was born in the 1960s, it was illegal to be gay in this country. And we now have a situation where 7 out of 10 people say it would be fine if Prince Harry had married a man rather than Meghan Markle. So you've seen an enormous shift.
Well, again, it plays up the point that culture is fluid. We make it. It's a social construct, and it's up to us to. Yeah. I mean, would you agree, though, that the harder wins, that not the easy ones, are looking at the whole life course and changing the narrative about what it means to take care of your health, to treat it as an asset, and not to engage in behaviors that are going to set you up for ill health?
Agreed. No, I agreed. So that is that is a massive cultural change between, thinking that your body is like a car that you buy. You can put any fuel in it, treat it how you like. You never have to service it, and it will last for 100 years. You wouldn't buy a car and treat it like that. But some people sort of treat their bodies like that. So this sort of acceptance of responsibility and a sort of sense of agency is vital. But of course, there are lots of perfectly rational on their own terms reasons why people drink and smoke, or eat, chips and lots of fried food and don't buy healthy vegetables. So,
well, if they feel marginalized by society, they reach for the things that are convenient.
Sure. And there are a whole load of behaviours and cultural differences, etc. So, but I think getting into this stuff is tricky, because how much does the state intervene? How much do you leave it to individuals? When we know that leaving things to individuals does not necessarily lead to optimum outcomes. I mean, it's interesting. If you take another area where we have made progress and related to ageing, which is pensions, where Mrs. Thatcher gave everybody in Britain the freedom to choose whether or not to have an occupational pension. In 2010, another Conservative government took away that freedom, and everybody was forced to sign up for an occupational pension where they were in employment, because leaving it to people's own free choice had left to about a quarter of people in work deciding they weren't going to save for a pension because they didn't have enough money, or they didn't know what to do, etc., etc. So arguably there is room for benign nudges, at least, if not benign despotism.
Now that we don't have the unions having much of a role.
Well, yeah. So that's a real challenge. And I think what's interesting is to look at, and again, I know that we are suggesting this, but to look at where things are working. For example, Wigan is celebrated at the moment as a place where they've made good progress particularly on early years interventions and getting kids ready for school, on diet, etc., and on some public health things. So the challenge always in this situation is that we find places where things are working in public policy terms, and we then think, let's just get everywhere else to copy that place. And of course, I've done this job for 32 years now, and of course, I used to think that. I've now come round to the view that just because something works in one place, there are all sorts of often cultural reasons why it's working there, and why it necessarily can't just simply be rolled out everywhere else. It's the same, interestingly, if you look at high flyers in the city, when they switch jobs suddenly, they don't necessarily become investment stars when they move jobs to a new firm. And the reason, when you start to unpick it, is that their success as a stock picker or an investor in one bank hasn't been repeated when they moved to the other bank, because actually it wasn't just their own talents. There was something about the setting in which they were working that allowed them to be successful. And when they change setting, they aren't necessarily as successful.
Absolutely. It's like society. Everyone has a culture, and the culture of a big business is the same as the culture of a community. I mean, you're all about, at Ipsos Mori, messaging, communicating messages, looking at opinions. How do you think we can communicate the crucial message that our collective good health is a national asset we all have to fight to save?
Right. Well, I think the first thing is understanding how people think about it. So, here we are making an assertion that, our national health is a national asset. Maybe some people don't want to be a national asset. They just want to, it's understanding people's motivations. So, for example, when we were looking at in Britain at how we get people to sign up for organ donation, interestingly, the academic evidence said the best way to do this was to play on empathy. In other words, think of all these poor people who are dying because they haven't got an organ. And, if you're going to be dead anyway, why don't you donate yours? And, of course, it turned out that rather than empathy, self-interest was the most effective motivator. So instead, what people get asked is, if you had an accident, or if you needed a new organ, would you accept one? And if the answer is yes, you're then said, OK, so you would take a spare kidney from somebody else. Could I just check? Are you willing to sign up to donate yours in the event of your death?
Perfect strategy.
And so when we talk about, this national asset, I think the first point is to actually understand how people see their healthy aging, their own personal healthy aging, before we talk about Britain's healthy aging. And then when we understand the taboos and how they frame that in their own minds, whatever messaging that we develop will have to sort of reflect that and where people are. And because what's encouraging in this space is that there is lots of evidence that if you get it right, you can see very big shifts in behaviour quite quickly. For example, on mental health, we've seen a doubling in awareness and concern about mental health in Britain, because Prince Harry and Prince William have been so forthright in talking about their experiences after the death of their mother, Princess Diana, it's become, there's all sorts of nudges. So as an employer, I've signed up on mental health. We've got mental health first aiders here now. We never had them before. So there are all these initiatives combined that tend to make a difference. But I think a lot of it starts from, in this case, destigmatizing it, which is, by having the royal family talking about their own mental health problems and all of these initiatives sort of playing together, you can see suddenly a massive shift in awareness. And indeed, in terms of where public appetite for public spending has shifted.
It's all about raising awareness, isn't it, and galvanizing the masses.
Yeah.
How is Ipsos Mori helping the APPG for longevity achieve its goal of 5 extra years of healthy life by 2035?
Sure. Apart from giving it a very small amount of money, what we're going to try and do is actually work on these very things itself. So, exactly what are the terms of the conversation that are going to be most effective. So we produced a report earlier this year called Perennials, which is looking at later life as it's portrayed in the media, the role of how stereotypes actually lead to shortened longevity. So we've reduced all the evidence that we can find. So one of the things that we're involved in with advertisers is to stop them using the doddering but dear stereotype in advertising. Because what we found is that if people have a negative attitude towards old age, they live on average about 7.5 years less.
Yeah, Becca Levy's study. At Yale. There's loads of studies that confirm that information.
Exactly. So we are going to work on the appropriate language, the framing, what is the most effective way to communicate these messages. So we'll be doing things like that with the APPG, along with organisations like the Centre for Ageing Better, who have £50 million to spend on some of this stuff as well. And it's about getting a whole range of organisations together. And the group that have, yet to really engage, the private sector, who still, don't want to acknowledge in the marketing community that the average the average new car buyer is now about 53 years old.
It's astonishing.
And they're all their advertising thinks everybody's about 28 or something. So
they need to look at the business case, and it's being made again and again. But as we see, corporates are more or less ignoring it.
Yeah. Well, people agree. There are signs, but these are the sort of challenges that we face, and changing the dial, the societal dial on aging, so that in the same way that our attitudes to homosexuality have changed over the last 50 years, our attitudes to aging, that our fatalism, that you're going to die anyway, what can you do? Well, the answer is there's a lot of things you can do. And so we have made changes, massive changes. Smoking, we've dealt with smoking more or less. We've got people to be more aware of what they need to do to have better heart health. But there's still a lot of things that we can go on doing. And I see all of this as a sort of continuum in a way, that we're just, we're trying to continually change the dial. It's a bit like sexism. What was acceptable, 15 years ago isn't acceptable anymore. What was acceptable 30 years ago is now illegal. So
yes, we're moving it along on a continuum. Absolutely. Yeah. And one final question, Ben Page of Ipsos Mori. How do you feel personally about your work with the APPG for longevity?
Well, I'm just utterly selfish. I'm 54 and I don't want to. My mum died of heart failure in her 70s, but when she was my age, she wouldn't do things. She would regard things that I do now as completely insane, because her attitude to aging was it was inevitable. There was nothing she could do, and it was all very bad that she was overweight. But that was just how life was. Whereas I want to have a healthy old age myself, so I'm keen to see it all play out, and I will try and be a flag bearer for it. That's so I have a certain amount of selfishness in it. But also, it's just I'm swayed by the data, and the data's pretty clear.
The data, the science, all of it. Thank you so much, Ben.
No problem.